All right. Okay, no point not getting right into the material then. So this week we have some interesting stuff to get into. Something I'd mentioned was coming. So we're going to talk about identity, which is our security system. The two main aspects are authorization and authentication. Actually, I should mention them in the reverse order because first comes authentication, knowing who it is, and then authorization, what they're allowed to do, right? So then we'll get into actually maintaining user roles and finally sending emails so people can actually, oh, I forgot my email, click a link and then have it send an email to allow them to reset it, things like that, right? So we'll get through all that over the week, but let me just start here. First of all, I'll mention this is a great resource for you that consider it as like the textbook for this actual component, right? It goes through a lot of the basics of what the identity system is, how it works, how we get things set up, and so on and so forth. So I encourage you to take time, come here and read through this. There's sample code you can download along with it as well, right? And we'll do our own little demo though, so that to work along in parallel. But this is a great resource. I highly encourage you to take time to come through it. This one, I almost feel guilty about putting it because it's a little long in the teeth. It's a little bit old, to be perfectly honest with you, but this is one of my favorite presenters ever, right? Scott Allen. And I don't think it'll start to play unless I actually click play, but it's a little old in that it was done even before .NET Core, really, MVC5. But, the basic concepts are all the same. So, I just love how he kind of presents things. I highly encourage you to take time if you can fit it in, right, to come along and actually go through his little presentation. Uh, you know, Kick back, put up your feet, have a cerveza or whatever you do to relax and enjoy this. It's a really nice presentation of the concept. So I just can't help sharing that, even though it's gotten a little bit behind the times. But as I said, the basic concepts are still 100% bang on. Okay. All right, so we're going to do our own demo though of identity. Now I've got a PowerPoint. I might as well start and go through that next. Okay. All right, let me just get my PowerPoint up and running here. And there we go. All right, so identity, security, okay, the whole thing comes down to these two-part process. First of all, authentication and then authorization. So we'll talk about that, but we've had it there. It's been there right from the beginning. When I first at the start of the term walked you through creating a project, one of the things I suggested that you do is when you first select the kind of project you're going to do, we came to this dialog box up on the screen where you set your framework. .NET 7 was what we were working on right now, but there was this authentication type dropdown, right? And I said uh, choose individual accounts. And because we did that as we first created the project, Visual Studio scaffolded in a whole bunch of support for the identity system. That's why when we looked under the data folder, in fact, that's the reason we had a data folder there to begin with, but that's where we saw our application DB context, which is the DB context that's scaffolded to actually work with all the database tables for users, roles, login information, and so on and so forth, right? And while I'm on that topic, I mentioned before that, of course, it's initially scaffolded with SQL Server in mind, which is why I suggested we delete that folder under data called just migration, and then run our command, which I put into our common commands to create the initial migration for application DB context, right? So anyway, it's been there all along. That's my point that I'm sort of saying. So what did we actually get from this? Well, kind of to summarize it, as it says here, built in, but very customizable way to validate and store user credentials, right? We can manage user authentication as well as authorization. So uh, it does follow our code first approach. And basically, you might say, well, where are the classes? Well, they're actually in there, but they're in a compiled Razor library, right? We'll show you later on how you can pull information, views, and so on out of the compiled Razor code and make it available for you to make modifications and so on later on. But it does follow the code first approach. Actually, you would have noticed that as well if when we re-scaffolded the migration itself, we had a quick look in there and you saw that it was creating tables for things like ASP.NET users and ASP.NET roles and so on and so forth, right? But it's a very flexible system. It works well with external login providers as well. So you can configure it to work with, allow people to log in with their Google or Facebook, Twitter, of course, which is now X, and so on and so forth. Microsoft, of course, as well, right? So you can have external providers as well as, of course, your own internal login system, or both. Works with both roles and claims. We'll talk more about what they are coming up soon. And of course, it's all designed to be very user testable as well. So just going back to the main two concepts involved. The first step is always the same, authentication. We have to be able to authenticate somehow or other who this user is that's connecting, right? Now that's often a simple username password combination. I'll mention right now that usernames typically these days are quite often actually an email address. And, in our initial work with this, we'll probably go on that assumption that although we can have a separate username, we'll probably just make sure the username, the email, and that's all there is to it. And then there's, of course, a password to go along with it. But keeping up with modern times, we're all familiar now with two-factor authentication. Darn those smartphones. If they'd never come out with those, we never would have had to bother with this. I know it seems like a bother sometime, but actually it's a very good protection to have two-factor authentication, and that's fully supported by this system as well. And as I mentioned, our external login providers as well, like X and Google and so on. Okay, so that's all about identifying who this user is. Once we know that, once they are actually authenticated, then the question is, what are they authorized to do? What can they see in the application? What can they do? Where can they go, et cetera, right? And that is usually handled in our side or in the back end through roles and or claims. Now, I'll be honest with you, the truth is roles are really just claims. So it all comes down to claims, but roles are a nice simplification that makes our life a little bit easier. Okay, so the concept of roles, as I said, it's traditional, it's easy to understand, and away we go, right? Uh, Only those people in a specified role are authorized to do X, Y, Z, right? So only an administrator can delete this record type of thing, right? Now, one thing to be aware of, there's a misconception about roles that it's some sort of a hierarchical system, like, it's sort of a government system or something where people are above each other. No, no, roles are independent of each other. It's a many to many relationship. So a user can be in many roles, right? And a role, of course, can have many users. Uh, this allows the flexibility for things like, you might be a supervisor, right, in one role, but maybe for the security area of the application, you're an administrator, right? So there might be a security admin role, which is separate from a regular everyday admin role, right, which is focused on maybe the production aspect of the system and so on and so forth, right? So we have the flexibility that a user can be in multiple roles, right? And that gives us uh, infinite choices of how we combine them. Okay, just to mention, you can also set up a policy. Policy-based authorization can simplify roles. So, instead of saying, well, you have to be in this role or that role or that role, you can define a policy that says, hey, if you're in any of these roles, then we're going to give you access, things like that. We'll see how that works in code in just a couple minutes. Okay, now, what is a claim in comparison? Well, I kind of gave it away. I mentioned that roles are actually claims, but claims are similar, but they actually have greater flexibility. Claims are more closely tied to the authenticated user's identity. Now, when I say identity, you'll notice that in IntelliSense, it'll often offer, instead of saying identity, it'll say identities, plural. Because if you think about it in the real world, you as a user, right, you're one person. But if you pull out your driver's license, that's one form of identity, right? That has your name and birth date and address and so on and so forth. But if you reach into your wallet further, you might find, I don't know, a CAA card, for example, or whatever, right? Well, that can be another different form of identity. And the system can support multiple identities for one user, right? That's how authentication works throughout the world these days, right? So if a particular identity that you associate with a given user has a property such as their date of birth, think again of a driver's license perhaps. Well, you could create a claim, okay, of legal age, right? Based on that date of birth, you could authenticate, are they old enough to drive, or are they old enough to, come into our application, right? And that's an example of the flexibility you have with a claim as opposed to simply saying someone is in a given role, right? Claims as well can be passed between login providers, right? So if somebody logs in with their Google account, then your application will actually receive all the identity information that Google carries around with it about this particular user, right? And that all becomes available for you to access within your application. So, it's very, very flexible that way as well. And claims also support policy-based authorization to make your life even simpler in the same way that we can do it with roles, right? So why wouldn't we just focus on claims? Well, you can. It's perfectly valid to do so. But I'll just make this little argument to you. As flexibility grows, complexity usually goes along with it, right? So because we're just starting out and learning this system, it's actually a lot easier to start just by focusing on roles. It's traditional. Everyone seems to understand that, hey, you got to be a supervisor or an administrator or whatever in order to carry out certain operations, right? So we'll start with that. And then later on, we can always switch into working in the more detailed, flexible arrangement of actually focusing on claims instead. All right. Okay, so we're going to assume here that as you created your project, you selected that option, individual user accounts, right? But the next thing you have to decide, really, we know that there are going to be entities created based on that are going to be stored in a database. So where are we going to put the data? And there's really two choices. I think I mentioned this earlier on in the course that you might consider having all the login information, all the identity tables in their own database, giving a clean separation from your actual production tables in a completely separate database. That often could be useful if, say, you're hosting multiple applications in the cloud, for instance, maybe using Azure, right? Well, you might have one database that manages all the information for all the different users, okay, and their login information. And you can access that, of course, from multiple different apps, right? And that way it's easy to reuse those logins without having to worry about maintaining things in separate databases for each one. So that might be one reason to keep it separate. But the way we set it up so far in our projects is we're storing it all in the same database. We're using the same connection string, and that's really what it comes down to, right? If you have two separate connection strings, one that you maintain for your production tables and one for your identity tables, then you just, as you create each context, our application DB context would use the connection string you have for your security tables or identity tables, right? And your own DB context, in our case, in our example, the medical office one, that would be set up to use a connection string pointing to the database where we want to store all of our tables for doctors and patients and so on, right? So right now we're using the same connection string for both DB context objects that we create. So we're storing all the data in the same database. And actually, unless there's a good reason not to, right? Unless there's a good reason, like you want to reuse logins for multiple different apps or things like that, I think this is the better arrangement, which is why I've defaulted in our course so far to do it this way. It allows us to actually relate entities in the identity system directly to the ones in our production tables, which is a flexibility you don't get easily in any other way. So there's really no harm, unless there's a good reason not to do it. I suggest keeping it all in the same database. Okay. Now, one of the things that we're going to need are some managers to help us out. Yeah, we could do it all technically with LINQ because it is just data in a database table, same as we've done with all of our other data. But fortunately, the identity system gives us a couple of things. There's a user manager and a role manager, right? And we have access to those in our application to make it much easier for us to actually work with users and even with roles, right? But one of the things we have to do right in our program.cs file, where we're building all the services that our application is going to use, there's one that'll be scaffolded there already because, again, we chose that option as we built the project, add default identity, right? Now, we're going to make two changes to the code that's in our program.cs. They're shown on the screen in the final version that we want. I'll talk about one, require confirmed account, okay? Basically that option, if that's set to true, then the the scenario is that a user would come register on the site, they go through the registration process, and it will send an email out to the account that they use as they register for access. And then they have to click the link that they get to confirm, yep, that is my email address, I have access to it, and that way they'll be allowed to log in. That's what the require confirmed account is about. Well, guess what? We aren't even there yet, right? We have no way at this point to actually send out that email address. So that would not be very helpful. So make sure you change that to false. Okay. Actually, when I was doing this with my class this morning, I mean, I know this well, but I was just hurrying and I forgot to make that one change, and it opened up a whole bunch of issues for me. So yeah, definitely make sure you do that. The other thing is the next line you see down, add roles. Okay, that won't be there. So we just come in and we, push enter, make it some white space, and we just call add roles. The assumption is we won't bother with roles. We'll just go directly to claims. But as I said, for the simplicity of it, we're going to start off working with roles. So those are the two changes we have to make there. Okay, now the next choice. How much of a Grinch are you, right? It's getting that time of year, Christmas is approaching, and I'm sure everyone is very familiar with that good old movie that we all tend to watch at least once a year, usually around Christmas time, right? Yeah, for sure. So, how much of a Grinch are you? You can set all these password settings, required digit, lowercase, uppercase, non-alphanumeric characters, and so on and so forth. How many unique characters do we have to have, and things like that, right? Uh, you can change all these, the Boolean from true to false and so on, depending on what, you actually want to do, right? Now, the required password, by the way, the length, 6 is a minimum. You can try to set it smaller, but it won't work, right? So 6 is the minimum you can get away with. Sorry, it's not going to let you even development set a 1-character password. There's just no way that that's going to work. So don't even try it, right? Okay. All right. Now, along with that, there's a few other settings, but we'll wait till we get to putting them in code and we'll talk about them. Just want to mention, of course, migrations. We already talked about the fact that the migrations were set up initially for SQL Server. So I encouraged you even earlier on to go ahead and delete the migrations folder that you would find underneath data, right? Because it was written for the other database system. And now that you've set up your code in the program.cs to tell application DB context to use SQLite, then you can just recreate that first migration, right? Then you're all set. And make sure that we can actually call database migrate. But what we're going to do is we're going to do something that kind of parallels what we did earlier on with the our own production table context, right? Remember we added an initializing class, okay? Yeah, like medical office initializer, MO initializer, that type of thing. And that's where we usually call context database migrate, but of course it'll be a different context this time. It'll be our application DB context, right? But we'll put that in that class that will call that code. And at the same time, we're going to make our life a little bit easier by initially seeding a few roles and a few users. So we have an account set up that we can log in, right? And that'll help us in our development work as we're learning how to use this whole system. Okay. All right, so that gets us up. So we have accounts, we can log in, and now the system knows who we are. The next big thing, of course, and the reason why we have so much emphasis on that authentication process is now we can control who can do what. What are you as a user authorized to do, right? So we're going to see how we can use roles and control access to the different areas of our application. Now, it'll occur to you probably pretty soon that there's two parts to this. The most important part is what happens in our controllers. And we have a simple annotation, authorize, right? And there's variations on it that we can put in there. We can authorize based on roles and policies and claims and so on and so forth. But the authorize annotation goes right in the controller, and that's what actually locks down, okay, or restricts access to the entire controller if you put it at the very top of the controller class, or you can also put it on each individual action in the controller, right? So that's what we're going to do. And that's the most important part. The other aspect that will occur to you is as we do this is, well, what about all those links in the user interface, right? If I'm saying no, you're not going to be allowed to create, right? But I still have the create link sitting there. some people might think, well, we should actually kind of hide that on the screen. We shouldn't actually make that visible to the user, tempt them to do something that we're just going to say, you're not allowed to do that, right? Well, that is important, right? Just from a user experience point of view. But for now, don't. Okay, that's my basic message. We will look at how to do that, and we'll explore different options for doing that later on. I think I have one slide in here that talks about it a little bit, but I encourage you not to do that right now because the most important thing, of course, is the actual protection that we're putting into the controller, because we always know that users can get around the fact that there isn't a link on the page, right? If they're a fairly smart user about how MVC works, they know they can just go up the address bar and type, you know, whatever the entity is, slash delete slash, and guess a number, right? And then that would allow them to try and go and delete a record and things like that, right? So just because there's not a link, that's no protection. It's the actual authorized annotations that we put into the controller. That's where the protection comes from. Okay, so as we go on and do the demo, just remember that even having one role defined gives you three, count them, three levels of authorization. Users, when they first come to your site, they're anonymous users. That's what we call them. They're not logged in at all. Now, once they log in, right, so they're authenticated, then we just call them a authenticated or a logged in user, but they might not be in any role. That gives us another level of security. And then, of course, if we have even one role, well, that's a third. And then, of course, we might have many roles, right, giving us more and more levels, so to speak. Okay, so how do we use this annotation? Well, basically, you can go right to the top of the controller and put your authorized annotation there, right? If you want, you can even specify what roles the user has to be in order to actually be authorized to come into the controller at all, right? By the way, you don't have to have roles equals. Hey, you can just have authorized all by itself, okay? And that just means that they have to be authenticated. They have to be logged in, right? To even get to the controller. Now, of course, individual actions can have their own annotation, right? So you might have just authorized at the top, so you can't come to the controller at all unless you're logged in. But then perhaps on a particular action, you up the ante, so to speak. You put authorize and ask for a particular role, right? Whether it's admin or some other role, right? So that's it. So each and every public action inside the controller can have its own level of security, you might say. Okay. And just a note there, and this is very important, and almost every time through the course, somebody loses a few marks at some point because they forget this next point. Note, you should always put the same annotation on both the get and post actions. So if you're going to, authorize that only roles equal supervisor, and that's the role that can do the edit, for example, well, then you have to put that same restriction, that same annotation on both the get for edit and the post for edit, right? Now, important, allow anonymous. So you might have decorated the whole controller with authorize, but if there's a particular action in the controller that you're going to allow people to go to that aren't even logged in, you can get around that by lowering the limitation and saying allow anonymous, right? That's obviously something you have to have if you're, putting restrictions all over the place. Something, how can you go to the login page unless it allows anonymous users, right? Okay. All right. So what if there are multiple roles that should be able to carry out the same action? Because remember, it is a many to many. It's not hierarchical, right? So, there might be a situation where, either of these roles, admin or user, if you're in either one, then you should be able to access this particular action, right? So you just put a comma separated list of the names of all the roles you're going to allow, right? And they can be any one, either or any of the ones listed. Okay. What about this situation? What if you want to say, no, they must be in both or all of the roles, right? Well, we can do that. We can do multiple authorized attributes. And that, instead of saying it can be in any of them, it would have to be in all of them. Or since I only have two here, they'd have to be in both roles, right? Again, taking advantage of the flexibility we have due to a many-to-many relationship between user and roles, right? So in this case, they'd have to be in the admin role and also in the user role in order to gain access to whatever this action result was going to do for them. Okay. So again, contrast, if you just comma separate them, anyone is fine. If you multiply them like this with multiple authorized attributes, then they have to be in all of them. Okay. So just to mention, you can also work with policies, okay? So this can be useful if you very often, in many cases, you find that, well, you know what? We often are combining that they have to be either this role or that role, okay? So you can make a policy as shown here in code, simply called elevated rights. And that means that you're requiring role, and then this is again, it can be in any of these. They might be a supervised, they might be admin, and so on, right? So it's just a kind of a shortcut. If you find you're repeating the same annotation over and over again, then this might be a nice thing to do. But you know what? It's never required. It's entirely up to you if you want to bother or not, okay? But in a case like that, membership in any of the roles listed on the require role area for the policy will give access, okay? And then you can just use it when you say authorize policy equals instead of roles. And away you go. All right. Um, so that's all about how we protect the controllers. And that's all I want you to do for now. But students are always curious, well, what about the user interface, right? Well, there's a number of different ways you can control what's visible there. We've done this kind of thing before, but it's just different questions we're going to ask. You might have an if structure. The most basic thing is if user.identity is authenticated. That means they're logged in, right? So maybe only a logged in user could see whatever HTML you have inside your if structure, create link or whatever, right? Oh, by the way, you can also test if user is in role, right? That way you can determine if they're in a specific role. Just note that the is in role method here only takes one role at a time. So if you did want to check that they're in admin or they're in another role as well, you'd have to do two separate. User is in role or user is in role for the second one, right? And we'll explore other options for this as well as time goes on. But as I said, at this point in time, just leave all the links there. Why? Because for one thing, we need to be able to test that we actually do have the important part of the protection, the important part of the authorization in place, right? In other words, I want to be able to click the links and see that I'm rejected, right? And that's the important thing at this stage in time. Okay, any questions about that? All right, now just to break up the recording, and that was about a half hour there, so I'm going to stop and start. We're going to get into our actual demo next.